Hi, my name is Kara Dickel, and I'm a student at Morningside College, and I study the effects of rubrics on elementary art students' creative self-efficacy. My problem statement was that the problem of assessing students in the area of art is a topic of continuous debate among teachers, administrators, and art educators. While assessing students in art is necessary for teachers to gain insight and evaluate ideas, there are many who view art as a special activity for elementary students to enjoy partaking in. One means of authentic assessment is through the use of rubrics. While with rubrics, students are able to assess themselves throughout the course of a project. However, rubric assessment may hinder creativity. I was curious to find if assessments in art hinder creativity and how assessments in art affect my students. Upon reviewing the literature, I found two themes. One was that rubrics improve engagement, and the second was that rubrics improve achievement. Results from the Artful Learning Project indicated improvement in student engagement and the quality of art making, as well as students embracing formative assessment. Mason and Steedy, 2006, found that using rubrics helped to simplify art incorporation into the curriculum. Positive effects and increased academic achievement with the use of rubrics was the outcome of a study conducted in 2015. In an experimental study conducted by Heat and Canty, 2012, results suggest that participants who used a rubric to complete their assignment performed better than participants who did not. The purpose of the experimental study was to discover if rubrics improve students' creative self-efficacy. The students in both groups were pre-tested and post-tested using a self-efficacy scale as well as a short scale of creative self. Independent samples t-tests were used to compare the two groups on pre-test and post-test. The participants included 36 fifth grade students. 36% of them were white, 61% were African American, and 2% were Hispanic. There were 47% that were girls and 53% were boys. 16% of the participants had an IEP. 25% of the participants participate in our ELL program, and 71% receive free and reduced lunch. The groups were randomly selected by homeroom class. I used clay tools, drawing tools, a Prezi presentation on the history of coil pots, and smartboard technologies. The procedure involved both groups learning about the history of coil pots through a Prezi presentation. It took 5 weeks. Each week we met for 54 minutes. The experimental group used the rubric and reviewed the rubric at the start of each class. The rubric was also on display for students to check at any point during their class time as well. The control group did not have access to the rubric until the project was complete. Once again, I used a short scale of creative self and a self-efficacy scale, and we used an independent samples t-test. The findings did not support the hypothesis that using a rubric throughout the duration of the 6-week coiling project would increase self-efficacy and creative self-efficacy. So if you look at the table 1, independent samples t-test results for pre-test and post-test on self-efficacy and creative self-efficacy. Figure 1 includes the means and standard deviation for self-efficacy pre-test and self-efficacy post-test data for the control and experimental group. And figure 2 shows the means and standard deviation for creative self-efficacy pre-test and creative self-efficacy post-test for the control and experimental group. Little research has been done on the integration of authentic assessment in elementary art. There's been an ongoing debate on how to accurately assess the subject of art, and challenges are present on how to fairly assess the visual arts. Taylor 2014 implies that art cannot be assessed because of its individual and subjective nature. Furthermore, Taylor suggests that art is about creatively solving problems, being inventive, and our own unique expression. Hager in 2012 challenges our ability to count the feeling we get from art on an assessment and indicates there is currently no valid instrument to account for our reaction to art. Shively, Stith, and Rubenstein 2018 noted that creativity is multidimensional and current rubrics that assess it unfairly combine creativity with neatness and appearance. In many cases, rubrics focus on the end product as opposed to the process in which students arrive there. Young 2009 confirms the notion that rubrics suppress imaginative thought and generate an atmosphere of rigid standardization to assignments. Lowenfield and Britton 1995 suggests that the art room should be the only place in school where marks don't count. Mason and Steedy found that rubrics were a useful form of assessment in art and helped to promote collaboration between artists and educators, support teacher planning, and help students to evaluate their work. This is in contrast to my study. While using rubrics throughout the duration of the coiling project with the experimental group may have increased awareness of the expectations, the collaboration between the student artist and myself was more redundant. Instead of exploring a more creative means to complete the project or pushing students to explore, I felt that the student collaboration accounted more for the rubric's requirements. Providing students with the rubric throughout our project may have given them insight on how they could have evaluated their work, but it also seemed to stifle their creativity as they seemed more concerned with the requirements of the rubric as opposed to the joy of creating. According to Bandura, 1993, a major function of thought is to empower people to predict events and develop ways to control events influencing their lives. In theory, the use of rubrics in the elementary art education could enhance students' sense of self-efficacy by providing them with predictable outcomes within a lesson. In 1993, Bandura suggests that self-efficacy is increased when desired accomplishments are reached gradually. Having the rubric on display throughout the study with the experimental group was meant to allow for gradual feedback and give students an opportunity to evaluate themselves along the way, thus improving self-efficacy. Extenuating gains enhances perceived self-efficacy, while highlighting deficiencies weakens the influences that people use to self-regulate, which causes a more negative performance. Students in both the control and experimental group were asked to complete the rubric after they had completed their coiling project. The rubric included 4 questions about the history of coiling. If students did not remember the answers about the history of coiling, the rubric may have accentuated their shortfalls. This could have negatively impacted their sense of self-efficacy, which in turn could have negatively impacted both the perceived self-efficacy and creative self-efficacy skills that they completed immediately following the rubric. The implications for students were that the study involved finding new ways to inspire creativity. Researcher Ellen Winner and her colleagues studied art classes for a year in Boston. They concluded that when art teachers teach through the 8 habits of mind, creativity is increased among students. One habit of mind named stretching and exploring is the equivalent of creativity. Stretching and exploring involves teachers encouraging students to take risks, to not be afraid of mistakes, and learn how to take advantage of ears instead of simply telling students how to perform a task. Exposing students to creative works establishing an environment in which unique and creative work is valued, and encouraging students to be inquisitive and exploratory are more ways to inspire creativity among students of all ages, according to Sparks 2011. An implication of the study for art educators is that rubrics may not be the best means to assess all student artwork. Teachers should use multiple methods to assess student learning in the art room. While a rubric may be beneficial for some, it may be counterintuitive to the creative process for others. Other means of assessment in the visual arts include sketchbooks, portfolios, demonstrations, writings, discussions, critiques, exhibits, and self-assessments. Art teachers need to be the ones who determine which assessment fits best with each project. And for administrators and curriculum directors, it may be beneficial to provide art teachers with further training and workshops on assessing student artwork. More research needs to be completed to help art educators find the best means for assessing students in the visual arts. Limitations and recommendations for future research. So, students only attend art once per week, which was one limitation of the study. The limited art time could possibly hinder the continuity of the research. Each week, students spent time reviewing the previous week's work and were reminded of the project and the expectations. After about the second week, some students tuned out the review phase in which the researcher reviewed the rubric. This may have led students in the experimental group who use the rubric throughout the duration of the project to tune out its content and expectations for use. To control for this, future research should be conducted in a setting where students are exposed to art on a more frequent and consistent basis. This can help keep students engaged in the project. Another limitation was that the researcher only studied 36 fifth grade students. The use of the rubrics throughout the course of the project could have a different effect on various grade levels. Since the sample size was small, it was challenging to gauge the study's true effectiveness. Future research could include not only more students from each grade level, but a variety of grade levels to gauge if using a rubric had a different effect on lower or upper elementary grades. An additional limitation to the study was the research was only conducted over the course of one coiling project and one medium, which was clay. Some students enjoyed working with clay and found it easy to manipulate, while others prefer different mediums to express themselves. Future research could conduct a study over multiple projects in a variety of art mediums. The lack of knowledge or training on how to use an assessment rubric was another limitation of the study. Future research could allow time for students to learn how to use an assessment rubric and practice working with it within the art room. As discussed previously, the rubric itself was a limitation. The fact that the rubric included 4 questions about the history of coiling was challenging, and if students had forgotten the answers, it could have negatively impacted their scales that they completed immediately following the rubric. The statistical procedure was another limitation to the study. Future research may account for this by using a repeated measures procedure. This way, comparisons could be made between both groups' dependent variables, while also controlling for possible pretest differences. This procedure would also show change from pretest to post-test. That's it. Thanks so much for listening to my research project, and I hope everyone's having a great day. Bye.